Good morning, friends and allies of transformation and inclusion for all in higher education. Today's webinar will focus on higher education, institution responses to the needs of staff and students with transgender identities and students with intersex developments. What an interesting topic it is. And thank you so much for joining us this morning. We know we all are busy with online learning, online studying, and so on. And so we would like to thank you for taking out the time in joining this very, very important conversation as organized by the University of Pretoria. They have developed a protocol for trans bodies and students and staff with intersex developments, and making sure that they have an inclusive, safe work and learning environment. My name is Anthony Brown. I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Johannesburg, but we work as partners with the various entities at UP. We are all part of this family in higher education to make sure that our environments are enabling and safe. Today, as part of our panelists, we will have Sylvester, who will be talking on the experiences of transgender students and staff. Sylvester will then introduce himself later on to the rest of the participants. We also have Sarah Matseke from the UP Transformation. We have Pierre Brouard from the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender. We have Thiruna, Naidoo from the Center for Human Rights. And we have Professor Anton Kok, who is an academic in the Faculty of Law and the Department of Jurisprudence. But before we start with this conversation, it's very, very important for us to know what is your positioning as a participant in this dialogue that we are having today. So there will be a poll with a couple of questions, and the poll is currently in progress. So we would like to know a bit of yourself, give us your demographic background, and also give us your view on issues of transgender identities and intersex developments within higher education. Should we have a specific policy? Should we have a standalone protocol that address issues of transgender identities and those with intersex developments? The University of Pretoria has a specific policy on anti-discrimination, and this addresses issues of various aspects of identity diversity and how it should refrain from discrimination. But at the same time, they have developed a protocol for transgender identities and those living with intersex development. Is there a need for this different protocol? Or should we just follow this anti-discrimination policy as an umbrella body? In order to understand much of this, we will invite our colleague from the UP Institutional Transformation Committee, Dr. Matete Madiba. But before I will allow Dr. Matete Madiba to address this very, very important dialogue, I would like to give you some background and experience from my institution. I have a colleague who recently embraced her transgender identity. She's a trans woman. And she lost her staff card and she rushed over to the security services where the staff cards are produced. And she presents as a cis woman. And when she was attended to, she gave her name. And the moment when she gave her name, she then realized there's some discomfort by this particular colleague in the security cubicle. And then the name was that of a traditional male. And he called all of his colleagues to say, there is a man that looks like a woman, and I need to replace her staff card. And I don't know what to do, right? And so these sort of confusions and sort of discomfort and discriminations are what trans people are subjected to at the workplace. This is not only to staff members, but it's also our students that experience these difficulties. So is there a need to support trans bodies through a specific standalone policy, or should it just be incorporated in the anti-discrimination policy that we have in our various institutions, and particularly at the University of Pretoria? But to start off this conversation, I would like to start with Dr. Matete Madiba from the UP Institutional Transformation Committee, who will then speak to us on the processes of developing this protocol and how it is considered to be an approved document within the institution. Dr. Madiba, over to you.
Good morning, and thank you very much, moderator and the organizers of this forum. I am privileged to be part of this discussion, and I come in to paint a picture of where this document is in terms of it being adopted as an institutional document that will bind everybody towards whatever responsibilities are implied in the document. My colleague Pierre will give you a more broader history about where this document comes from. But initially, my understanding is that it was initiated by students who approached the Center for the Study of Sexualities, AIDS and Gender, and asked for assistance in terms of their needs. And from the center, Pierre took the lead to consult, and he talked with a number of people, including myself. And the proposal was that a task team should work on a draft, and the draft will then be used across the institution as a concept paper, kind of, and we will talk through until we are at a stage where it is adopted as part of our policies, procedures, and protocols. And indeed, Pierre delivered on the promise. Together with the task team, a document was produced, which we now refer to as the Trans Protocol, a guideline to understanding, managing, and responding to the needs of trans and intersex students and staff at UP. I'm not sure if we still want to keep the managing part. I am very suspect of that part myself, but I see it, yes, as a guideline to understanding and responding to the needs of trans and intersex students and staff at UP. So we have this document, and it has been circulating across various offices and people, but at this stage, it has been formally presented to the Institutional Transformation Committee, and members of the committee have taken it back into their faculties and departments for discussion. The next step will be with all the comments that we get for P and the task team to revise, and once it is finalized into a copy, we will then send it to the executive for approval so that it becomes part of our suite of policies in the institution. So that's where we are with it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Madiba. I want to applaud the University of Pretoria. Very few institutions in higher education are willing to unsilence and are willing to make it visible that minority identities are catered for, are included for, that institutions are transforming to make sure that learning institutions are safe spaces and inclusive spaces for all. I think it's very commendable for an institution of your magnitude in having gone this length. Now, what Dr. Madiba has mentioned earlier was that this was a student initiative or a student-led approach when they approached the Center for Sexualities, AIDS, and Gender to ask them for assistance. And so we have a student today with the name of Sylvester. And we're going to ask Sylvester to share his experiences with us as a transgender activist at the University of Pretoria. I will ask Sylvester to give us a bit of feedback sorry, not a bit of feedback. I will ask Sylvester to give us a bit of background of himself so that we can have a context and understanding of the role of the transgender activist. Over to Sylvester.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. So my name is Sylvester. I'm a trans man from Uganda. I'm a trans activist, and currently I'm doing my master's with the University of Pretoria under the Center of Human Rights. I'm thankful that I enrolled for this course because it has broadened my understanding around human rights, but also made me a more prominent or greatly aspiring trans person. So I work for the Trans Network, which is an NGO in Uganda that coordinates trans-led organizations. And I'm really excited to be a part of this meeting. So to respond to one of the things you mentioned is around my Ugandan experience in university vis-a-vis my stay in the University of Pretoria is different. I would really say that there's a big difference in my mental health and how I do things. Coming from a university like Matseke, which is the most progressive university in Uganda, also creates biases for trans persons. And if you're not of a great character as a trans person in a country like Uganda that has no policies at national level that protect sexual minorities and gender minorities, it really fuels a lot of first personal stigma or self-stigma, and then the discrimination that comes with the community we stay in or we have to associate with. I've had many trans folks drop out of school because of the stigma that is fueled in most of the universities in my country. There are actually some universities where you cannot enroll for studying as a trans person, because in Uganda, trans people are more like the face of the LGBT community. So you find that most of the stigma and biases from the community directly affects trans folks, right? So one of the things that I really liked, or one of the things that I would like to share, was my experience with the Center of Human Rights. And this, with any cis person or someone who doesn't understand the real niche and needs of trans people, would think it's a normal thing. So approaching the Center for Human Rights, and for the first time in my life, having to go to a gender neutral toilet or washroom really is one of the best things that have ever happened to me in my academic career. Can I call it career or something? Because you find that in Uganda, most people do not even really go to school because of such small things that can be sorted by universities or institutions of learning. So personally, my experience as a trans person and being in UP and comparing my academic experience in my country is really different. I really commend that the university actually looks at this protocol as something that is going to be empowering to trans folks or trans students in the campus. And my plea is they take it on and adopt it as a policy. And personally, coming from a university, like I said, that doesn't have even any policy in place, to be in UP that has an anti-discrimination policy really is an additional for my stay at campus, knowing that at least I'm going to walk safely, right? And this is what transgender persons need, to be in a space where they feel they do not need to hide their identities because they are scared of what is going to happen to them if they walk on one street that has no people in campus. So practically, that's my experience comparing the two situations that I've been in or studying from two universities, one that has at least progressive policies and one that is really still lagging behind, and coming from a country that has no policy in place that protects LGBTQ persons, and then being in a country that is receptive to gender and sexual minorities. Yeah, so, yeah.
Well, Sylvester, thank you so much. Not only have you shared with us your experience at UP, but what it means for an LGBT, for a trans body from countries with diverse sexual orientations and gender expressions are not allowed, when we have policies, institutions, and services that are affirming, inclusive, and protective of those with trans identities. Now, before I continue, I really want to encourage all participants, as you are viewing and joining this dialogue, that you please fill out the poll that is currently running. We really will appreciate your input. Now, one of the very important aspects of this trans protocol is language and what we mean when we talk about trans bodies. I quickly want to go back to Sylvester. Sylvester, for the sake of our participants, would you just briefly explain what do we mean with transgender identities, with transgender bodies, transgender expressions? Sylvester?
Thank you again. So I'll give my narrative in a sense that we all come from societies that shape us differently, or we are all nurtured from societies that really shape us differently, right? So you'll find that it's hard, even if you taught a class of students about gender, language, or things that need to be used when it comes to trans persons. You'll find that most of the people in that class would pick up some things, and majority of some of the students in that particular class will still be tied to their probably spiritual being, or the way they nurtured hinders them to process whatever you're trying to actually teach them on how to address trans people. And this is something that actually fuels biases and stigma for trans people to be in institutions of learning or setups where they'll find people who do not really understand their issues or problems, right? So you'll find that some people or some trans persons cannot take the fact that they are going to be misgendered by a professor every single day they come for a lecture. So you'll find that this person will not actually be paying attention to what the professor is teaching, but thinking of the pronoun the professor is using on them, even when they probably made it clear that, you know what, I am this, I identify as this. So these are some of the things that come out. And I'm glad that the protocol really has a very wide part where it explains the definitions and the language to use for trans folks, right? When I looked at the protocol, it really expands and makes sure that you understand some of the languages that you need to use when it comes to trans and intersex persons and what is not valid, right? So if we could expand on it to actually bring out the very, very things that shouldn't be called trans people, like those things that make them feel out of place, if you said so, it will really be an additional, right? So I feel like the protocol as it is structured is really, really nice to address trans issues and make trans people feel like they're in a community that is receptive and protective of their rights. But it's a process, and I'm glad the protocol mentions things to do with training sessions and sensitizations for both staff and students. That's very, very, very important, because the moment you draft a protocol and then people do not even want to understand what is it, then what it means or what it entails, then it's a waste of time, right? So I'm grateful that whoever formulated or drafted this protocol put the factor of actually making sure that people get the sense of what does it mean to be or to live with a trans person in the same environment. How do you make them comfortable? And we're not saying we want to be comfortable because it's a special thing. No, we want to be comfortable because we are in a place that we have things that really put our morals and way of living down, from growing up and meeting communities that are really suppressive in terms of what we affiliate to, that is not the so-called, gender normativity of doing things, right? So this protocol is good, and I'm not saying it's going to spiralize intersex persons or GNCs or trans people. It is here to probably help trans folks be in a place where they feel their rights are really respected, and they feel they're in an environment where they can study without being biased on the language or the set of institution they're in, right? So I believe that when it comes to what you asked of language, and then what it means to be a trans person in an institution or working as a staff is going to be solved by this protocol, because perusing through it and understanding what it communicates really gives me a broader picture that it's a step and a milestone that the trans people in UP are going to be grateful about. The other thing that I would want to mention around also what I feel that it addresses is the issue of shared residence, right? And this goes back to what you said, or answers partly what you said, where you find that most of the setups in higher institutions or institutions of learning really do not put trans people's needs at the table, where you find that most residents are shared or stuff like that. Some trans people are not really comfortable with sharing let me say residence or a room or an apartment with people. So it's good that this protocol really points out the fact that it is advocating or putting a point where there should be, or UP should provide for single-based residence or rooms that could accommodate trans folks' mental health and well-being, and at that put them in a place where they are comfortable at being learning or giving their best, where they're in a best place to actually learn more or not feel they should leave or drop out of school because of some of these small issues. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for for that detail, because I think it really speaks to the complexities that we find in our institutions. It's very important to realize that our institutions emanate from a history of compulsory heteronormativity, as Sylvester has pointed out. There are specific norms that your sex or your sexual organs, for that matter, should align with the social scripts in terms of gender. If you have a penis, you must be a man. If you have a vagina, you must be female. And then you have to follow the scripts and the services and resources that are available according to these scripts. In order for us to understand this protocol further, so that it can work towards inclusion, I want to call on Pierre Brouard, who's from the Center for Sexualities and AIDS and Gender at UP, to discuss with us the aims of the trans protocol in a climate that is so constructed and framed with compulsory heteronormativities. Pierre, over to you.
Thank you, Anthony, and hi everybody, and welcome to this really important conversation. Dr. Madiba is right. This really started out of the experiences of a particular trans student who came to our center and said, can you help me? Because I'm struggling with the systems of the university as a trans person. It's very much located in the stories of trans people. So for example, a study that was published about 2 years ago looked at 7 different universities in South Africa and the needs of particularly trans students. And just some things that came out were, for example, a very clear lack of policy direction from those institutions meant that when trans individuals approached lecturers or admin staff for support, in a way they had to rely on the goodwill of those individuals and hopefully that they were sympathetic. And what that kind of means is that each time you want to navigate a system in the university, whether it's with your lecturer, whether it's the residents, whether it's about student cards, whether it's interacting with the platforms, the IT platforms, you have to negotiate over and over again with staff members. And it's potentially embarrassing. You don't know how you're going to be received. And I think that kind of policy silence means that you really are subject to the whims of the people that you are working with. I think so what they identified was a need for a systematic response. Let me give you an example of our own university, where at the beginning of this year, we helped a student, a trans woman student, who has applied to the Department of Home Affairs for name and gender marker changes in her identity documents. But until then, the university relies on her current ID number, which says that she is male. And so, you know, we approached all of her lecturers to allow her to have her name on class lists and tests, etc., as her chosen name. And thankfully, everybody was supportive of that. But now we've arrived at a situation now in the middle of the year, where a lot of the learning has moved online, and the online systems rely on the identity number, which says that she is male. And therefore, she's going to be outed, because she presents as a woman, she's going to be outed as trans, and face the potential stigma and discrimination from classmates and other people. And we've engaged in a system of trying to get this to change, and understand that there are complexities, there are legalities, but the individual at the heart of it is really struggling and has to face this every time, this issue of having to come out as a trans person. Sylvester's talked about bathrooms. Trans people, staff and students would say that they are policed, that they struggle to find bathrooms that they can use, and that can have health difficulties for them. And then residences is a big issue. We've worked with students who, because their identity number says that they are male or female, depending on what the number says, The residence allocation system works off that identity number. They are placed in a residence space that is at odds with their own gender identity. And they have to face finding accommodation, sometimes privately, at a further expense. So there are a number of ways in which students particularly face these challenges. Our health systems, or our campus clinics sensitive to the needs of trans students, for example, would be another area that we have to focus on. So indeed, we put together a committee of people. We work with trans students. We worked with various role players across the university, and we developed this protocol. And the aim of it is to, simply put, to make life easier for people who are trans, but also for people who might be intersex, or for people who might be simply non-binary or gender diverse, because it's easy to slip into, we accept or work with trans people as long as they look cisgender, and we can sort of get our heads around that. But there are people who are gender queer or diverse or non-binary in some way, and our hope is that the protocol creates an opening for the university to think differently about gender, that the world is not necessarily binary, and that we believe this could have a knock-on effect around gender more generally. So we want to build an inclusive campus. We want to help people who are transitioning. So I've personally sat with a trans student in a meeting with the head of department where they announced that they were trans and asked for the support of the head of department to then make an announcement to key people in that department so that they could then allow for their transition process to be received with respect and dignity. You know, and I'm happy to do that, but I think a more systematic approach would allow an HOD to draw on a protocol and say, okay, what are the next steps that I need to do? So we want to also tackle in the protocol the bureaucracy. We're up against systems which don't always change quickly or easily. We're up against legality issues, but we believe that there can be a system where until the person, and if they're going down this road, is making legal changes to their name and to their gender in terms of their identity documents, there can be another way in which the university systems allow for a more informal name change until the legal changes happen. We think this is possible. We can be creative. We can do this. And the protocol also wants to look at stigma and discrimination. Not only how do we address it when it happens, but how do we prevent it in the first place? How do we build a campus that is sensitive and inclusive? So Sylvester talked about how the protocol talks about sensitization work when someone is transitioning. So we have an anti-discrimination policy at UP. We believe this protocol realizes the aims of that document, which aims to build an inclusive and welcoming home for all. So we developed this, it's a draft at the moment. It hasn't finished all the steps that Dr. Madiba talked about, but our hope is that it would then be something that is an official document. It covers transitioning, what it is and what the needs might be of a staff member or a student. It talks about how sensitization work could happen and who needs to do it. It talks about how we could address stigma and bullying. It talks about confidentiality in communication, because you can imagine each time we send out an email about someone's needs, 10, 15, 20, 30 people get to see that email. How do we protect the person's dignity in that process? The document talks about language. What are the right words to use? How do we understand trans identities? How do we understand gender diversities? It touches on the needs of foreign students, and it also talks about emotional support. The student counseling units, the employee wellness programs, we believe, if they aren't already, can be equipped to work with trans and gender diverse students. And then it sets out different roles for different parties. And at the end of the document, it says, if you encounter a trans member of our community, here is a plan. Here's a planning process that you can undertake. And who are the people you need to do, speak to? What are the next steps that you need to undertake? How can you revisit this plan to ensure that the person is being supported through their journey? So in essence, the protocol is a guideline, and we hope that if it becomes a policy document, a living policy document, it's going to create a space that's inclusive for everybody. And that's our vision at the moment.
Thank you so much, Pierre. I think that explains quite comprehensively what this policy is. Just for those who have joined us in this discussion, there is currently a poll running on your view whether we need a separate guideline on prevention towards discrimination of trans bodies and those living with intersex developments. So we'd like to invite you to please participate in this poll. At the same time, we welcome your questions based on the topic and some of the presentations that we have had so far. I would like to move on to the next speaker, but before I do that, I want to go back to Pierre and just ask Pierre, I probably missed this in the draft document, but how does issues, or how does this document impact issues of curriculum when we teach as academics in our various faculties? Because our students can, your cisgender students can learn so much from curriculum issues. I've noticed with my students at my institution, when it's not a matter that affects them, they don't care about a policy, they don't care about protocols, they don't care about how others should be respected. And so how does this protocol speak to the broader student and staff community to be proactive in guiding them to be more inclusive and responsive to trans bodies and intersex and people living with intersex developments in terms of curriculum and other means? I probably missed that. Could you probably just speak to that?
You missed it because it wasn't there, Anthony. I think, no, look, I think the protocol as it stands doesn't speak to the question of the curriculum or even, I suppose, the teaching and learning space per se, although it alludes to discrimination. And I think what the protocol would allow, if a trans student, for example, experienced transphobic utterances in a lecture, then they would be able to take that forward. That is already, in any case, covered in our anti-discrimination policy, which Prof. Kok will be speaking to. And I think he may then also speak to the question of teaching and learning environment and also the research context. Because what happens if transphobic research, for example, is conducted by an institution? And I think the anti-discrimination policy would be the tool that could assist with that. But I think you're right, that is something we could think about in terms of, in addition to the protocol, but currently it is silent in that. Maybe just as an aside, my own center is working on what we're calling a social justice barometer, explicitly looking at gender justice, sexual justice, and reproductive justice. And in that, it speaks, it's in draft form at the moment, but it speaks to the question of the curriculum and teaching and learning environment, and to what extent it might speak to forms of gender and sexual diversity, for example, and whether that is consistent with the values of the institution and our anti-discrimination policy. But I think in sum, the protocol doesn't speak explicitly to the curriculum, but I think it is something we could consider adding to it. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much for that response, Pierre. Much appreciated, because I think what we need to take in account here is that the university is a means to an end. We prepare students for the world of work. And as much as we are preparing students to navigate the years of studies at university, when they eventually transition into the world of work, this knowledge becomes so essential. But But Pierre mentioned something very critical. It is the anti-discrimination policy that focus on aspects of preventions and responses to discrimination. So this trans protocol seemed to have a lot of intersections with the already in place and established and operating anti-discrimination policy of the University of Pretoria. I want to invite Sarah Matseke to speak to us on how does this trans protocol enhance, support, or disable anti-discrimination policies. From certain discourses, people might argue, why should there be special mentioning or a special protocol or a special guideline for trans identities? Are we going to have special protocols and guidelines for every minority now? Or can we just have an anti-discrimination policy in an umbrella form that addresses this? Ms. Sarah Matseke, please speak to us.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Yes, my name is Sarah Matseke. I'm the Acting Transformation Manager for the University of Pretoria. Yes, Dr. Brown, we do have an anti-discrimination policy as an umbrella policy. However, you know, if we can just take it down a little bit, if you're holding an umbrella, it's an umbrella, it covers a whole lot of things, but there is somebody below the umbrella that you need to come down to. So the anti-discrimination policy is a good policy. It's an all-encompassing policy for the University of Pretoria. It covers a whole range of human rights violations and discriminations of all sorts, and it goes across the board. And it also covers issues of gender, sex, gender identity, gender expression, and intersex status. However, just like all other aspects of discrimination within the policy, it doesn't go down to the specific and descriptive discriminatory practices and behaviors that people experience on the ground. So it is very necessary to have a separate protocol or an addendum or a guideline that goes deep into the issues. And the transgender protocol is not the only one. For example, the anti-discrimination policy, it covers issues of disability management. It doesn't drill down into disability management, but it says discrimination on the basis of disability. But then we have another policy that goes and drills down into disability management, because there are so many elements of disability that can be included inside that policy, but it's so cumbersome. So we have a separate policy for that, and then it becomes specific. So I do believe it is very beautiful to have this protocol, because it talks to real descriptive and pertinent issues that transgender people experience. Things that Sylvester mentioned, that the misgendering of transgender folks is really described and explained very well inside the trans protocol. So this particular protocol will be a supplementary policy or protocol or guideline into the anti-discrimination policy. And if people are feeling like, no, why are we being separated? No, it is not a separation. For me, I really believe that it is much more beautiful to have a specific focus. Now, it's not something that gets mentioned inside the anti-discrimination policy as it is right now. It is something that is really specified, you know, and put out in all its elements and in all the areas of challenges that are there. And currently, like the example that you gave on the security cubicle person, that the example that you gave, there is a need for sensitization within institutions. Now, this protocol also has elements to that this is what needs to be focused on. Yes, the training content will be expanded beyond the protocol, but these are the key elements inside of the protocol that are really pertinent and very important in this matter, that we need to now develop a training manual or a training document that will address those kind of issues, that will go to residence placement, how people need to behave when they address a trans protocol, because without education, we will not understand. And I was giving an example earlier about Sylvester. I've been in meetings with Sylvester where I myself, as the transformation manager, I have misgendered him. So if you can understand that if I'm in this space of transformation and there is potential for me to use wrong language and wrong identities on people that I work with, because we have been wired and society has really educated us to be so binary. It is important to have this real, serious focus on transgender education. So the anti-discrimination policy and this protocol are not going to be separate. This is an addendum to the anti-discrimination policy, because the anti-discrimination policy as well is a very all-encompassing policy. It's a policy and it's got a manual. The policy gives you all the generic umbrella areas of sex, race, gender, intersex expression. And then you have the procedural manual inside. The procedural manual now goes down and specifies what cases needs to be reported to the transformation office, where to report, who else can assist in this support, what to expect from the investigation process. Now, when it comes to my area, because my office is the operational office for the anti-discrimination policy, and we are also the compliance office for all the faculties and departments to say who is not complying to the anti-discrimination policy. Now, with the protocol, this will assist my work to say, in the part of the procedural manual that says what needs to be expected from the investigation process, this protocol will also educate me and assist me in my assessment of cases, so that I can be able to say, no, but you are not following 1, 2, 3, 4. This protocol says 1, 2, 3, and there is guidelines and there is this 1, 2, 3. Therefore, you are discriminating against this person. So currently we don't have that. So with this protocol, I will not be thumb sucking. And or maybe perhaps, or normally I usually consult with Pierre to say, Pierre, can you please assist on this case? Because I'm not a jack of all, but Pierre is my partner, we work together. And Pierre, please guide me on this one. With the protocol, it will now be a supplement and an addendum to the anti-discrimination policy to guide the procedural manual as well, to say what steps were followed, what wasn't followed, and therefore where is discrimination and what needs to be done about it, and who did it and who's accountable.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah Matseke. I really applaud you for being part of this very essential task team. One thing that stands out for me here is that South Africa is known for its very impactful and powerful policies. But we are also accused of having these policies collecting a lot of dust. And I really want to applaud your office of thinking already about the next step of education about the protocol, because it can just simply be a protocol if there's not an education process that will then ensure that this protocol becomes functional and becomes a living document and becomes an enabling tool for transgender bodies. I really want to commend your office not to just stop at the process of having this protocol, but think of the next step in making it a living document. Now, part of this protocol is to ensure the prevention and the response towards discrimination. Now, this can be a tricky process. As Pierre has mentioned, there are various legal challenges with this. And although we have legislation that is very affirming and protective and enabling for gender diversity and sexual orientations in South Africa, there are various loopholes and challenges that we find that often creates a pushback against these progressive documents. I want to invite Professor Anton Kok from the Department of Jurisprudence in the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria to further talk us through the aims and the intent that will make sure that issues of gender discrimination for people with transgender identities and intersex developments are prohibited, and that the environment does become a home safe and inclusive for them too at UP. Professor Anton Kok.
Thank you for the opportunity to address you. Sarah mentioned the existing UP discrimination policy already. I'll go into a bit more detail about the policy. The protocol, the trans protocol, obviously talks very closely to the UP discrimination policy, but just in brief, I can't possibly deal with all the complexities of the policy, but the existing policy, it's already in place. The Transformation Office already empowered to deal with it. It also has very broad standing provisions. So it's not only the individual affected student who may approach the Transformation Office. A class action may be brought. If there's a group of students in the same situation, they may approach the Transformation Office. Even a student body or a staff body could approach the Transformation Office on behalf of another student. So that's another option that you don't have if you are in a vulnerable position, or you are apprehensive about going to the Transformation Office. You don't have to do that on your own. You don't have to expose yourself. There are other options available as well. The UP Transformation Policy prioritizes substantive equality. So that's not just equal opportunities for everyone, that's actual equal outcomes. The policy talks of celebrating diversity, not just accommodating or tolerating diversity, celebrating diversity, which is something completely different. The policy prohibits direct and indirect discrimination. The example that Pierre mentioned about the UP admin system linking to ID numbers, that would be an example of indirect discrimination. Even if UP itself is committed to celebrating diversity, to including sexual minorities, if they, for whatever reason, rely on ID numbers and that has the effect of excluding students, that would be an example of indirect discrimination. Intention is not required. The UP can be as bona fide and as good-willed as they wish if the effect of their procedures and policies is to disadvantage a student or a staff member. That would be discrimination. The UP policy defines discrimination as withholding a benefit or imposing a burden on a student or a staff member. And that burden can be a mental or psychological burden as well. It needn't be an economic or physical harm. The emotional impact of a decision can amount to discrimination as well. The UP discrimination policy prohibits discrimination on a wide-ranging number of prohibited grounds. As I can list them, and they all in some way or another speak to the topic for the day: sex, gender, sexual orientation, belief, gender identity, gender expression, intersex status, physical appearance, body shape. All of these are already listed in the existing UP discrimination policy, already prohibiting unfair discrimination on one or more of these grounds. You needn't just choose one of these grounds. A combination of these grounds often also cause the exclusion or the discrimination. It's also not a closed list of grounds. Any other ground that could cause or perpetuate systemic disadvantage or that could undermine human dignity will also be recognized by the Transformation Office. So if over time it becomes clear that the existing list of grounds are not as exhaustive as we thought it was, it still allows the Transformation Office to recognize additional new grounds. Some of the other examples that Pierre mentioned, police bathrooms or residences, those would be examples where UP are probably also in breach of the existing UP discrimination policy. Never mind the existence of a trans protocol or not. The UP discrimination policy as it stands already empowers the Transformation Office to engage with UP on matters such as bathrooms, residences, marking systems or you know the names that or the prefixes that appear on student cards or staff cards. All of these issues can already be raised with UP based on the existing UP discrimination policy. I mentioned that the policy prioritizes substantive equality. Substantive equality often means taking positive measures designed to protect or advance persons or groups of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination. It often means money, therefore. It means structural and systemic changes. So if UP's IT systems have to change, for example, to not link to ID numbers in future, that could be one outcome. I mean, if you have a student number at UP, a staff or a student number at UP, do you need the link to the ID number, for example? That is a discussion to have with UP's admin systems. If there's not a huge administrative burden on UP compared to the impact on the dignity of the student or staff, that to me, from my perspective, with not necessarily all the information at hand, that to me sounds like an outcome that should benefit the student or the staff, a pro-inclusion, pro-diversity approach, instead of linking to something like, or for the moment, saying that we have to link it to your ID number. That to me is not a self-evident answer. We need more. We need a discussion between the Transformation Office and other interested students and staff and the UP IT systems and admin staff to understand the reasons for the link to ID numbers and why that's even necessary. As I said, the policy prohibits unfair discrimination. Three of the most important factors figure where you have to establish whether discrimination was fair or unfair is whether the complainant's dignity was infringed, the impact of the decision on the complainant, and the position of the complainant in South African society. Sexual minorities are vulnerable or marginalized in South African society. The impact on their dignity is severe. Those to me are important indicators that the current systems and procedures at UP may well be in breach of the existing UP policy. The trans protocol obviously strengthens the hand of complainants, but there's already an existing policy that allows for dialogue and hopefully a pro-inclusion, pro-diversity outcome for these matters. I'm happy that the trans protocol has been developed. We probably need something similar for sexual orientation, for students. So when we say sexual minorities, in all respects, you mentioned that we still live in a heteronormative country and university, that we address all of these matters of exclusion and vulnerability. The UP discrimination policy allows all of these dialogues and systemic interventions to take place. I'll leave it there for the moment. Happy to take some questions as well.
Thank you so much, Professor Anton Kok. I think that you have provided us quite a comprehensive understanding in terms of aspects of discrimination, the links to the institutional anti-discrimination policies, but also how this links to the broader constitutional values and legislative processes that we have in this country that prohibits discrimination, that are proactive in creating a pro-diversity and inclusive environment. So thank you for that discrimination. I am just thinking with that last comment you made, we will probably have to consider another protocol for sexual orientation. Is this perhaps not just a good opportunity to link these two topics together in one protocol dealing with aspects of gender diversity and sexual orientation? Our last panelist for today is Thiruna Naidoo. Now, Thiruna Naidoo is from the Center for Human Rights, who was part of this task team in developing this protocol. Now, Thiruna, many a times we find that these forms of discrimination, dehumanization, vilification, exclusion are so deep-seated. And when we do develop these guidelines and protocols, that we get a lot of resistance and backlash from many departments in our institutions, be it at higher education, be it in the broader society. Part of this development of this protocol, what sort of resistance have you experienced, and what can other institutions learn when they develop a protocol similar to what your institution has done? Because honestly, you are setting a big trend for us. Very few institutions have gone where you have. What were the resistances? How have you dealt with it? And what is it that we can learn in the development of a protocol of such nature? Thiruna?
Okay, thank you, Anthony. I think in the time when I was involved with assisting with the drafting of this protocol, the most important thing we had to consider was what are the needs of the community. And I think it was of paramount importance for us to hear from trans students and staff members themselves. What are the specific challenges that trans and gender diverse people experiencing at the University of Pretoria? Being a person of a cisgendered identity, having a cisgendered background, I cannot holistically understand the full experience of navigating the university as a trans-bodied or gender diverse bodied person. So it was very important for us to source out those experiences to understand where are the specific needs, and building the protocol, what will be the priority. And I think the outcome has been focusing heavily on language, because a lot of the challenges that trans-bodied people experience are that lack of recognition of who I am, in this community. And I think on behalf of the broader LGBTIQ+ community at the UP, as part of the UP community, the biggest challenge is this historic invisibility for these groups. And I think going forward, this formal recognition through the protocol brings us so many steps forward in moving towards a truly inclusive and integrated student community, and for staff members as well. As I think it's very important that when we approach the needs of specific communities, we think of everyone who would be impacted, everyone who would interact with an individual. I think in your case, from the example you presented to us, with the women who went to go and get a new access card, and it was actually someone who worked for security services who discriminated against her by commenting and outing her to other people at that office. It shows us that it's very important to approach the rights of transgender and gender diverse people in a broad sense, and not just focus on the direct interactions between students and lecturers and things like that. We have to focus on the community at large and tie us to a central value system, which I think is what the anti-discrimination policy does. The anti-discrimination policy sets out that everyone who enters these premises is bound by a central code that is built on a principle that we all recognize, the principle of equality. And in order to achieve that substantive equality, we will have to take extra measures to assist marginalized communities with integrating better into the community. Yeah, so that's what I've witnessed, and that's what we were able, I think, to do to some degree. But I think the question going forward is, if the protocol can be developed into a policy, what will the policy look like and how will it function? Should it be something that's separate to the anti-discrimination policy, or should it be integrated as part of the operations manual?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Thiruna. I think what I do hear from you is the decade slogan, nothing about us without us. And it is very important that the voice, the experiences, the daily realities of trans bodies and intersex bodies are heard, are considered, are affirmed, are then integrated in this development processes. I do want to underscore that we live in a country with our frameworks that claim that South Africa belongs to all of the people who lives within it. And that sense of belonging is very important. And if I think of the word belonging, means it can be connected to other words such as affirmation, acknowledgement, protection, recognition. When you belong, these are sort of synonym words when you bring a sense of belonging to a particular institution. And what I do here is that this document is doing just that, bringing a sense of belonging when you are a staff and a student at the University of Pretoria. I think that this institution is miles ahead of the many other institutions we find in South Africa. I want to cross over to our participants, and I know that you have quite a diverse number of questions that you have and would like to pose to your panelists. We have sort of 15 minutes or 10 minutes rather to address your questions. So as quickly as possible, if you can pose those questions into the chat box, we will appreciate that. Then also, we will run a second poll very soon now, and we would appreciate if you can respond to the items in the second poll as well. We are aware that you have participated in the first poll. The second poll has a few items. We quickly would like you to respond to the items in the second poll. So please, we invite you now to participate in the second poll. And then in the meantime, if you have specific questions in terms of this trans protocol. Then Pierre is asking for a question. Yes, Pierre, you may come through.
Thank you, Anthony. I wanted to ask you a question, not to put you on the spotlight unfairly, but I mean, you've heard that we're grappling with this at UP. I'm just wondering, if you were to engage in a similar process at your university, how do you think it might be received? I mean, what are the key alliances you think you might need to build to develop something similar, if you thought that was necessary?
I think, Pierre, that's a very important question. Our institution, the University of Johannesburg, where I am teaching, started to respond to the various needs of trans students and students with diverse sexual orientations without guidelines and without policies. So they introduced gender neutral bathrooms, gender neutral facilities. And there was very little education with this process. There were very little guidelines. We do have residences, for example, that are gender neutral, but there are no processes in place. And so people approach these responses to trans bodies in a very ad hoc manner, in the way they understand it. And from our various departments, not all of them understand the intricacies of trans bodies, the realities that they experience on a daily basis. And I think a document of this nature will give us a unified, a standardized way to ensure that the very needs, the core needs of our trans bodies, intersex bodies, students with diverse sexual orientations, diverse gender expressions, non-binary students are then responded to in a formalized, ensured way that is enabling and inclusive to the student, and not to the person who's sitting there with the power to make certain decisions. I think guidelines are absolutely essential. I already thought that in the next few days that I would contact you to look at how can we work in alliance, because your experience is essential for all universities. So I want to commend you for developing these protocols. It is essential for every institution to ensure that no one is left behind, that all students have a sense of belonging, that there is a pro-inclusive environment, that there is a pro-diversity environment, and as Professor Kok already mentioned, that it's a celebration and it's in a proactive stance. And this is what the protocol enables. I think it is a very essential document and a very essential process that many of us can learn from.
Thanks. Anthony, I think I saw Thiruna's hand. Did you want to say something, Thiruna?
Yes, I just wanted to mention that I think a very important thing to recognize that when addressing the needs of transgender bodied people at higher institutions of learning, we need to understand that because of the laws in our country, there are legal requirements before you can begin to medically transition, you know, and get that formal recognition for your transitioning status. And because of that, the university space is often the first place where people are coming to terms with their full ability to transition and to be recognized and be seen, you know, in the way that they need to be seen. So although some people have had the opportunity to socially transition during their teenage years, it's only after they turn 18, after they potentially enter the university community, that they're able to rapidly take some of the steps needed to fully transform and self-actualize into their identity. And I think it's because of that, it's of more importance to prioritize the needs of people of transgender bodied status at these higher institutions.
I think you raise a very, very important matter, Thiruna. And I want to latch on to your comment now, because my research is mainly on schools, and currently I do research with trans-bodied school youth. And what I have learned is that not all of them want to go through the medical transitioning. Some of them prefer the social identification and the social transitioning of the transgender status. And so we find now that there is sort of a conflict with what the law permits and then how students or young people or individuals identify within this framework of trans-bodied people. So how do we navigate that process where a person says, I don't want to go through all of these medical processes, I am going through the mental identification of a trans-bodied identity? Any of the colleagues, Prof. Kok, Thiruna, anyone on the panel?
Well, I have a reflection on that briefly, if I may.
Yes.
We're also living in a time when there's a kind of, I would say, argument building that is suggesting that young people, not necessarily in South Africa, are being pushed through their gender transitions too early and not being given time to sort of come to terms with who they are. And I think, well, obviously one wants to be cautious and thoughtful for anybody's transition. I think there's a danger in suggesting that young people don't know what they want, and to create a kind of resistance almost couched in the language of we must protect our children. I think often people who are trans know very well who they are. They've had many years to come to terms with it and to think about it. And I think our job is to be supportive rather than to challenge whether they are in fact trans. Certainly when it comes to people at university, they're of age, and by that point, they're as Thiruna said, they're legally able to continue with their transition from a medical perspective. But I think it's worth mentioning that the protocol speaks to the idea that one shouldn't have to formally go through a medical or even a social transition to be recognized as a person who's entitled to self-identify in whatever way you choose to. You can be trans, you can be non-binary, you could identify as agender or genderqueer. And my hope is that we don't try and force people into new categories. Yes. That the protocol speaks to the idea of diversity of expression. And if you wish to be called this rather than that, you know, there should be a way for you to be able to do that and to navigate your way through university life with respect and ease, rather than feeling you have to belong to a particular identity to get new forms of recognition, just new categories of inclusion and exclusion.
Yeah, I cannot agree more with you. And thank you for that response, Pierre. Can I just quickly go to Thiruna? Are there any questions in our chat box? Thiruna?
It doesn't seem as if there are any questions, but I think maybe to also add on to what Pierre has said, I think the university has the opportunity to kind of set the example of going forward how trans people can be integrated into the UP community and provide an opportunity for other institutions to learn from this endeavor. So I think it's very important going forward to pick up on the development of the protocol and to add onto it. So I think I would also like to say, if there are any like trans students or staff members who have been able to participate in this discussion or will be watching it later on, if you could come forward and perhaps add your case study as well to identify any new emerging needs. And I think as well, Anthony, you say you work with people in the education sector. I think you know as well that our understanding of gender is still developing, you know, and gender identity and expression, it continues to develop. You know, a few years ago, the idea of people being non-binary or being genderqueer, gender non-conforming wasn't something that was well understood, but we've come to a point where we recognize these identities and we have people who can come forward and speak about you know, this identity and what it means to them and how they came to their understanding of their gender identity and expression to fit outside of this binary. And I think that as we decolonize these spaces, we'll be able to make room for new emerging identities as well. So I think the protocol is also designed in such a way to not just focus on static identities, such as trans-identifying people, but also people who are gender diverse, so that there's an opportunity for that development as we understand emerging identities better as well.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And I do also want to raise or highlight the aspect that Professor Kok mentioned earlier, that these identities that you speak of should not be so static, because many of them are intersectional in the sense that it would be a trans body with an ethnic related matter. It could be a trans body with class or religious aspect. So all of these various aspects of identity are very critical in documents such as these. I want to come back to Dr. Madiba and ask her to wrap up this conversation for us. What is the way forward? And as you're developing this process, what do you propose to other universities in terms of adopting, considering these processes?
Thank you. I am so glad that we are at a point where we have a well-written document. What is happening now, it's a matter of refining, polishing it, making additions, improving the language to make sure that by the time it is approved, it captures every aspect and in the best way that we can. So a number of people are bringing their contributions in terms of suggestions of where they see gaps and how to fill them, or where they would like to raise some kind of changes. So once we've completed that process of people commenting on the current version, we will then collate, and Pierre started the work, I hope with the task team. We are channeling all these contributions to a central place where Pierre, with support, will be able to rework and end up with what I would consider to be a final version. And by that time, everybody who is supposed to see it would have seen it, would have had an opportunity to make a comment. And we will then take it and write a wraparound motivation to make sure that it gets to the executive and it is approved as part of the institutional policies around anti-discrimination. And I think through this process, definitely other universities can learn. We cannot afford to continue to work in our universities with these forms of silences and silencing. I do not think that the South African legal framework allows us to work with those type of exclusions, because when we become silent on this type of issues, then we enjoy our biases and we exclude the people that have to be part of the community and enjoy their full rights. So I think it is a process that many other universities can follow. It is really not a difficult path to work through. I wish that we could have been faster in terms of having it approved, but of course it takes time, and COVID has also added to the slowness of the process, but we are almost there. And I am so proud of my colleagues that they are paying serious attention, because comments are coming through to really refine the document. And by the time we have the final version, it will be the kind of a version that we are all very proud about, and it will enable us. It is not only for students or staff who are part of the trans community. It is also to empower us, the rest of the university, to make our lives easier so that we can carry our responsibilities in the best way that we should. And I find it a very enabling, from the definitions that it contains and the guidelines that it offers. I find it a very useful document, and I would encourage other universities to follow suit if they haven't started with their processes. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Much appreciated. You have set a very solid example. We are envious of your process. We encourage you not just to formalize your document, but also do a wraparound on the processes that you have followed to where you are today, so that we can learn from that. I want to end this conversation with a quote from our first president, Tata Nelson Mandela, who said, "To be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedoms of others." And thank you for what you are doing to respect the freedom of everyone, and that no one will be left behind, including people living with trans bodies and people living with intersex bodies at the University of Pretoria. I trust that this was a very informative session, and thank you for the time that you have taken out to have joined us. Much appreciated. Please stay in contact with the institution if you have further questions. Thank you so much, Thiruna. Thank you so much, Pierre, and all the panelists to have allowed me to be part of this very important conversation. It was more of a learning opportunity. Over to you, Thiruna.
I think we have a last word from Sylvester, and then we'll be ready to close unless any of the other panelists would like to make a final address.
Could you repeat that again, Thiruna?
I said that Sylvester would like to say a word before we close, and I asked if any of the other panelists would like to say something as well.
Okay, I was just thinking of our time here, but let's have each colleague give a minute to each colleague, or each of the panelists a minute to give the closing remarks of this discussion. Let's start with Sylvester.
All right. Thank you, Anthony. So one of the things that you really actually pointed out was around issues to do with trans people who really don't want to do transitioning or go through gender affirming surgeries or take hormones. Like what is the best way to mitigate this when it comes to university settings? Like Pierre said earlier, like universities have an opportunity to change the narrative around trans people being affirmed in institutions. And one of the ways could be us as trans folks or people or allies advocating for such provisions that universities can put in place to make sure that transgender persons or intersex persons are in a position that they feel comfortable with their names on their identity cards by actually if a person is in a higher institution of learning, that means they are of a legal age to decide of what name they would want to use on their academic documents. So probably one of the first ways I would think is to create a third gender on most of the institutions that accommodate trans folks. Like, I feel like that's one way we could probably mitigate some of the issues of trans identity and intersex identity in institutions of learning. That was one thing I wanted to mention. But the other thing, in my conclusion, I would say that there is no one in the world that does not want to be in a place where they feel protected and safe enough to operate. And trans folks or intersex people or GNCs are also human beings that would want to be in a place where they feel that their fears are addressed and that they can operate as normal human beings. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your time and sharing very, very beautiful experiences that you have had with the institution, the University of Pretoria. Sarah Matseke, your closing remarks?
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Yes, I would like to really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. It's really very crucial to have this conversation so that we can look into real issues that are on the ground. I would like to appreciate Dr. Madiba and Pierre and all the colleagues' work. And I am ready and looking forward to the approval of this by the Institutional Transformation Committee and an executive. And I will partner with everybody to make sure that the education and awareness of this protocol and all the challenges that transgender people and the whole LGBTQI community face, to make sure that people are educated so that we may change behavioral attitudes and how people are assisted by administrative staff and all the challenges that everybody will face. So I look forward to the whole work that is coming after this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah Matseke. Pierre Brouard.
Thank you, Anthony. I'd like to thank everybody who made this webinar possible, and also colleagues at UP for their support, particularly Dr. Madiba, who has really pushed this process through our Institutional Transformation Committee. I think that support is crucial. Thank you, Anthony, for fantastic chairing as well.
Thank you so much for having me, Pierre. Professor Anton Kok, your closing remarks?
thank you as well. I echo all the other presenters as well. Thank you for allowing me to speak at the event. Very happy to have been part of this. I applaud the efforts on the, on the Transformation Office, on the existing UP discrimination policy and the trans protocol, all in service of making UP a much more inclusive space where diversity is celebrated, where we become a nurturing, welcoming space for all our students and staff. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for your wisdom and insight in this dialogue. And then from my side, I want to thank the University of Pretoria to have invited me to this very, very important webinar. I want to give over to Thiruna, who's going to give her closing remarks and close this session.
Okay, thank you everyone for participating today and for the questions posed. We will be sharing a recording of this on the Center for Human Rights platforms, and you can keep in touch with the center and keep track of any upcoming events through our website, and you can also keep track of projects by the CSANG through their website as well. It's all been, the information has all been posted. And hopefully we will be meeting soon in the coming months and be getting feedback on the progress of this UP Trans Protocol. So thank you once again for coming and participating, and have a good day further.
Thank you.
Thank you and goodbye.